Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, I welcome you all to the International Conference on Understanding International Migration. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished moderator and of the session, uh, Dr. Jeevan Baniya, fellow scholars and participants who have joined us through Zoom and are watching us live on YouTube as well. We are glad to witness your presence today. This international forum aims to bring together rigorous and erudite scholars working on the migration issues from all over the world over a single platform. This conference is a full-day event with 11 different sessions, with 2 sessions running parallelly through white and green room. The conference features 73 scholars from 25 different countries who will be delivering their presentation and sharing their understanding on international migration. The session is streaming live on YouTube, so please feel free to share it on your social media handle with hashtag ICUIM2021. Please do follow us on Twitter, contact NICE, and subscribe our YouTube channel, NICE Nepal. This is the 8th session of the conference. To chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Jeevan Baniya here with us. Dr. Jeevan Baniya is an assistant director at Social Science Baha and faculty member at Tribhuvan University, where he teaches master's and PhD degree courses and supervises students in their dissertation work. Dr. Baniya has master from GSIS, Anju University, South Korea, and PhD in political science from the University of Oslo, Norway. Without any further ado, sir, may I request you to take the session forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal. First of all, I would like to thank Ms. and Pramodji for inviting me to moderate this session. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening in your respective time zone. It's my pleasure to moderate a session in which we have a panel of distinguished speakers today who will be basically discussing on a very pertinent issue. As we know that migration has been an integral part of all the societies. However, this particular discussion is also timing in the sense that everybody is talking about migration and migrants, particularly during the time of this pandemic and the kind of impacts that it has had on lives of millions of people across the globe, and not to mention South Asia here. It will be, I hope it will be quite interesting to listen to the distinguished speakers, particularly who focus on the issue of migration and development, how migration and immigrants have been governed in South Asia. And some of the panelists will be discussing about different forms of migration in South Asia and what has been in terms of their rights and vulnerabilities, particularly during the time of the pandemic. And some of the panelists will also be discussing and sharing their experience in terms of integration of immigrants and migrants in the region. And we have several other cross-cutting issues about migration, migrants, and immigrants. So with this, I would like to first welcome Dr. Anju Helen Bara. Dr. Anju is the assistant professor at Central University of South Bihar, India, and today she will be giving the presentations on migration, development, and India's policy towards its immediate neighbors. Dr. Anju, you might start your presentation. Thank you. And sorry, before you begin, I think for the benefit of all the panelists, we have set aside about 10 to 12 minutes for your presentations. If you have any further points to make or issues to discuss, we'll have time to discuss it later in the Q&A session. And for all the listeners, we'll be taking your questions through the chat box. So if you have any particular questions, please feel free to inbox your questions and concern in the chat box, and we'll collect them and share it with the presenters. Thank you.
May I start, sir?
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Professor Jeevan Baniya, my co-presenters and dear friends, today I'm going to present on migration, development, and India's policy towards its immediate neighbors. Civilization and historical relations have shaped the migration and labor mobility between India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. Population movement have always played a vital role in the structural transformation of societies and economies. There has been a long tradition of free movement of people across the borders in this particular region, which I'm referring today, that is India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. In this particular paper, which I'm trying to develop, the idea is like how the cross-border migration have affected the bilateral relations between India and Nepal, India and Bangladesh, and over the years. If you look into the international migration, we see that it is about the movement of population for the purpose of temporary or permanent settlement. World Bank, in its work, it defines that there is a massive potential for growth and poverty alleviation in both origin and destination countries. And henceforth, we see, it has also become a part of the Sustainable Development Goal. And the migration has become very crucial, be it in the World Bank or ILO, or even in the international and national policies where it is being understood as a very pertinent area. Migration, it is being understood, and most of the people who migrate, they see it as a livelihood strategy and as a survival mechanism. The drivers of migration processes that we see here, the push and the pull factor, majorly the region which I'm referring to, poverty is one of the important reasons that why people, they migrate from one region to the other. The economic, the social factors are the reasons, also the cultural factors. There was a study which was being done by Nair University, and there they pointed out that majorly marriage is one of the important reasons that why people are migrating to India from Bangladesh and Nepal. Another factor which is very crucial to understand is the political reason, that whenever there is any kind of a political turmoil or any kind of a war, people, they choose to migrate. The recent studies which has been done in this South Asian region, it is from SAPE 2020, they point out that poverty, unemployment, rural distress, and natural disasters are some of the important reasons for people migrating from one region to the other. So henceforth, when we look into the features of the international migration in South Asia, we see that there is a very strong connection between poverty and international migration, wherein we see that how especially Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, we see that how the people are migrating majorly to the Gulf countries. But here in this particular presentation, I want to see that what is happening to those people who are migrating from Nepal to India and from Bangladesh to India. When we look into the profile of those people who are migrating to the other countries, we see that majorly they are low-skilled or semi-skilled migrants. Another important problem which arises when we talk about the international migration and the migration across the borders, it is irregular, it is undocumented, majorly the illegal migrations which is happening, and where the illegal recruiters, you have these middlemen who are using the porous boundaries, because India and Nepal, they have the porous boundaries, and how they are bringing these people in an illegal way, and it causes a lot of problem. Trafficking, yes, trafficking which leads to usually the women, the children and all, how they are being exploited, and also the labor who are being trafficked in an illegal way are being exploited in these host countries. So South Asian region, it consists of 8 countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives. Here it is Bangladesh, India, and Nepal for this discussion. And we see that there are few major corridors in the South Asian region: Bangladesh to India, Afghanistan to Pakistan, Afghanistan to Iran, India to UAE, India to USA, and India to Saudi Arabia. So India is both the origin, the host, and the transit country. And Bangladesh, again, if you look into the data, we see that it is also one of the one of the origin country, and sometimes it becomes a host country also. So in these three major countries, Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, we see that there is a colonial legacy. Bangladesh and India, before the partition, they were together, and hence there is a cultural relation, there is a historical relation, there is the relation of the languages and the ethnicity, and which has, though the borders have been created, but the interlinkages and the relations are still continuing. There is a cultural ties, and with Nepal also, India shares the cultural ties with both in Bangladesh and Nepal. If you see the migrants from Nepal and Bangladesh, the amount of immigrants in India, we see that it is like, of the total population, it is only 0.4% of the population, which is the immigrant. And this data I have taken it from World Bank, and the top source countries happens to be Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Malaysia. The Bangladesh, the out migration, we see that it is around 5% of the population, and the top destination countries are India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, UK, United States, Pakistan. Similarly, in case of Nepal, of the total population, around 7.1% of the population, they move out, and the top destination countries are India, Saudi Arabia. And the numbers which are mentioned here, 5% and 7.1%, these are the official data. The unofficial, the illegal migration has not been counted here. So the data here I'm referring is from Bilateral Migration Matrix 2017-18. So if you look into the migrants from Bangladesh to India, it's quite a huge number. Similarly, from migrants from Nepal to India, it is around 5,37,570. Though there is also the migration which is from India to Bangladesh, approximately, if you look into the profile of those who are migrating to Bangladesh, particularly to Nepal and Bangladesh, majorly they are the low-skilled laborers who are migrating to Nepal and Bangladesh, and that is also a seasonal and a temporary migration. So from India to Bangladesh, it is around 35,250, and from India to Nepal, it is approximately around 4,40,198. And the NSSO data 2001, this is the old data. I tried to look into the new one. So here the marriage, the search for employment, and the better employment, the better scope, and social political reasons, which I have told you are the major reasons. Now, India, over the years, it has established itself as a strong economic country in this region, and henceforth, there is a pull factor where India provides, or India seems to be a lucrative for the employment purpose, and that is one of the explanation that why the immigrants are coming from Nepal and Bangladesh. If you look into the Nepal, like it shares around 1,850 kilometers border with India, along with 5 Indian states, and these are the porous border, the open border, and henceforth the mobility, the movement of the people is very frequent. And as per the 1950 treaty, which India and Nepal had, so there is a free border, there is a free mobility, and people have been moving in and out along the borders since a long time. Similarly, in case of Bangladesh, it is around 4,000 kilometers border through the 5 Indian states, West Bengal, Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Mizoram. Now, the borders are open. Over the years, India, Bangladesh, and India, Nepal, if you look into the bilateral agreements, and if you look into the kind of the policies, they have worked and cooperated on areas like trade, connectivity, road and rail, energy, irrigation, infrastructure, and projects, infrastructure and other kind of projects which is people oriented. But over the years, we see that this mobility has also generated a point of contention among the countries, where the migrants are not being accepted, and migrants are looked as a problem, especially in the bordering areas of India, particularly if you look into the Tripura and Assam. Let us look into the way the foreign policy has evolved. If you look into India's foreign policy from NDA 1998 onwards till 2014, we had this two government, National Democratic Alliance and United Progressive Alliance. They gave greater attention to SAARC countries, and expanding the economic and security links with neighboring countries was the motto. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership since 2014 onwards, we see that there has been the dialogue, the conversation has been more rigorous, and the neighborhood policy, the immediate neighborhood policy has become very strong agenda of the foreign policy of the present government. Also, we see that the series of meetings which has happened during, pre-COVID and also during the COVID, and also the series of the visits. Say, for example, in 2014, Modi first visited Nepal, and also he had visited Bangladesh. And these visits, these virtual meetings which has happened last year also, it is basically signaling that India wants to play a very proactive role in its neighborhood, and it wants to take the leadership. So foreign policy begins at the nation borders. This is what is the outlook of the government of India. So as I told you, that what are the issues and challenges? One is the border dispute, the open porous dispute, which we see. It is related with primarily with two things. One is a security concern, because over the years we have seen that how the terrorism has, the cross-border terrorism has come up, especially from the Bangladesh, and also the kind of internal terrorism which has erupted, the extremist movement which we see in the case of Northeast region, the border areas which are along the Bangladesh. And also recently we see that there is a dispute which is happening with Nepal related to the border and related to the territory. So the question of the sovereignty, the question of the territory has come up. And in this thing, we see that how India and Nepal and India and Bangladesh are tackling. The domestic politics, again, one of the important reasons has been the influx of the immigrants, particularly if you look into the case of Assam, where the influx of immigrants, the illegal immigrants, have led to demographic changes in the bordering states. And this phenomena has totally transformed the larger, and it has brought up a larger social problems. Also, we see like the problem of Assam Accord, it has not been able to resolve the problem of the immigrants, and the recent dispute which has happened in the internal politics of India related to the CAA. We see that how the immigrants have become a major concern for the Indian government and the Indian politics. The economic conflicts, here it is basically there is a fear that it will lead to the relative deprivation and the discriminatory economic policies. And also definitely there is also a fear among the people that there is a scarcity, and it will lead to taking away their own resources. There is also a fear of cultural marginalization, a negative attitude towards migrants. It is compounded by fear of displacement, loss of identity, loss of their languages.
Now, you've already, I think, taken up more than 15 minutes. So can you please?
Yes, so this is the last slide, sir. So what are the concerns related to the international migrants? The SAARC country, in the SAARC country, which is like a regional group here, in 2014, it agreed to work together to improve conditions for their migrants, but we have very limited success, and nothing much has been done. Though the ILO and the other international conventions, they talk about giving living condition, improving the living condition, decent work and dignity of the international migrants within the nations, but till now we did not see it getting materialized. There is a poor regulation and controlling of informal brokers and illegal recruiters. Also, there is a political unwillingness towards managing illegal migrants, and the trans-border migration management is yet to take rapid action here in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anju, for that very succinct presentation. We have another speaker lined up. May I introduce and welcome Arpita Dwi. She is a researcher at Asia in Global Affairs India. And Ms. Arpita will be speaking on the topic neither here or nor there, cross-border migration in South Asia. Arpita, you may start. It seems like Arpita is not with us, so can I request Chitra Rawat if you are ready? I think Arpita is supposed to join us later. So let me introduce Chitra Rawat. Chitra Rawat is a research assistant at India Migration Now. And she will be speaking on Nepalese migrants in India overview and integration. Chitra, you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, please start.
Hold on. Right.
You have the slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Jeevan, for the introduction, and thank you, NICE, for organizing this event. So what I will basically be talking about is Nepalese migration to India, and I also understand that there are certain hurdles to it in terms of data, in terms of what we actually know about it. So let's have a primer and look at what the cases of open borders are when it comes to India. So in fact, the Indo-Nepalese relationship or the open border is neither the only one and nor the first one. India already has an open border with Bhutan under the Treaty of Peace and Perpetual Friendship. However, there are certain differences between the Indo-Bhutan Treaty and Indo-Nepal Treaty. One of the major difference is that there is an equal treatment. So the Indo-Bhutan Treaty under Article 7 states that the Bhutanese nationals will be treated at par with the Indian nationals. And that kind of clause is something that we find missing in the Indo-Nepal Peace and Friendship Treaty. The other thing is that the Indo-Nepal Peace and Friendship Treaty is based on a reciprocal relationship. So we can't really say it is as an equal relationship. And one of the ways in which this was evident was when some time back, the criteria for granting citizenship to Indians married to Nepalese nationals was changed in Nepal on the basis that it has to be similar to what was the criteria for India to grant citizenship to to Nepalese people. So these are the two main differences between the Indo-Bhutan Treaty and the Indo-Nepal Treaty. So now we come and we just look at what is the nature of migration from Nepal to India, and this is mostly from the point of view of Nepal. So CESLM had did an analysis of the migration, and it says that it's actually interesting that India and the Middle East have almost equal proportion of Nepalese migrants, and that is also a significant decline to India by almost 40% from the Nepalese census of 2011. So Dr. Ganesh Gurung from Nepal Institute of Development Studies, he had actually done an analysis where we had given certain slabs to economic groups who migrate to India. And as we see that the lowest economic group, that is the group E, migrates to India. Another thing that Anju pointed out was, the growing fact of transit migration, which is happening, where India becomes a transit point for Nepalese nationals to travel to the Middle East, most of the times through irregular channels. Next, here we do a comparison between what the census of Nepal states and what the Indian census states when it comes to migration to India. And I mean, one good thing is that both the censuses are conducted in 2011. So we kind of have some kind of a metric when it comes to the time period of comparison. One of the interesting things, although we see that despite the shortcomings of the data, we see that the number of people, Nepalese nationals in India, are quite the same according to both the censuses. However, what the major difference is that the census of Nepal, the difference in gender and migration when you compare both the censuses. So while the Indian census says that there is a high percentage of female migrants, the Nepalese census says that there is a high number of male migrants to Nepal. And it's not it's not a slight change in number, but you see that when it comes to census of Nepal, it states that almost 80% of the migrants are male, whereas the Indian census holds the number to somewhere around 30%. So the next thing is, like, from India's point of view, so there is a rise in, so despite the fact that there is growing transit migration and the percentage of the people who are migrating to India has reduced, there is still an increase in the Nepalese migration to India as compared to the census 2011. Another important thing is that according to the Indian census, 63% of the migration takes place to rural India, whereas when we see where exactly the males are migrating, they are migrating more to the urban areas than the females, which is, which is really less as compared to the males. Next on, we see what are the top destinations of Nepalese migrants in India, what are the top states where people migrate to. So Bihar and Uttar Pradesh out of the top 6 emerge as the more dominant states where a lot of cross-border migration takes place to India. And there are also, there are certain, in the sense, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, they not only share the borders with Nepal, but they also have a relationship that goes back to a lot of time, especially the Madhesi population. Next, we see the duration of migration, and this is also from the Indian census. It is actually very telling to see that a lot of migration, the most migration that has taken place is for more than 20 years. But the thing is that it is also, the data is also inclusive of marriage migration, because there is no, we don't know the kind of migration that takes place or for what reasons, but we only know the duration of migration. Where the place where we have more male migrants, male Nepalese migrants, is what we can term as seasonal migration, so which is less than 1 year, which was an interesting statistic. And when we looked around it, we found out that the hill regions, which is Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, actually hold 35% of the seasonal migrant workers from Nepal together. And these are also places where you have horticulture, also places where there are a high concentration of hill stations. And this also defines that a lot of migration, which takes place from one of the most marginalized regions in Nepal, which is the Sudur Paschim, it actually takes place to Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. Yeah, so next on we see migration according to gender. So as we said that only 33% of the migration is male, according to the Indian census, whereas 67% is female. Now when we take a deep dive into where exactly are the male and the female Nepalese people are migrating, we see that for female, again, the population, almost 86% of the top 5 are migrating to the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. When we look at the Nepalese male population, there is actually a higher concentration of people migrating to Maharashtra, and then Himachal and Uttarakhand. So this is also a place, this can also be a place of inquiry. So when it comes to integration, I think my colleague Rohini is going to explain it a lot better. However, when we are looking at the challenges and important considerations, we also have to understand that unlike the Indo-Bhutan Treaty, there is actually no clause of anti-discrimination against Nepalese nationals. There are cases where there is language barrier. However, what needs to be understood is that Nepali is also a lingua franca in Sikkim and North Bengal district. So, I mean, it also depends on where people are migrating and how people are migrating. So a very holistic view of Nepalese migrants to India has to be taken into account. The other thing is that on the reciprocal treatment, the technical certifications from Nepal are accepted in India, but the only catch is that the labor force in itself is low or unskilled, and quite in some cases also seasonal. So where we see, say, for example, in Uttarakhand and Himachal, you have people, and also in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, you have people who are workers, especially in hill areas where Nepalese people are mostly, workers actually are mostly employed as porters. So, I mean, this is the entire overview that we are looking at for the Nepalese migration to India. And I hope that this opens up some space of dialogue and consideration for all of us. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Chitra ji. You manage your presentation within the time allotted for you. Thank you very much. It sets time for other presenters and discussions. We'll come back to some of the issues that you've raised. Although there might be concern about whether the data, the old data that represents the number is accurate or not. Yeah. And there are also issues about other challenges facing migrants from respective countries for their various kind of integrations in the respective society. So we'll come back to that later on. Now I would like to welcome our next speaker. Since we don't have Peter, can I request Rohini Mitra to give a presentation? So let me introduce Rohini Mitra. She is a research coordinator at India Migration Now. And she will be speaking on international migration and immigrant integration in India. I think it relates to the previous presentation by Chitra. So, Rohini ji, floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are. Please.
Okay, great. I just need to share my screen. Just give me a minute. Yes. Is this fine?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So first of all, I'd like to quickly thank NICE for inviting me here and for allowing me to share the work that my organization and I do on the topic of international migration and immigrant integration in India. So today I'll be providing a very broad overview of what immigrant integration policy looks like in India. And I'll be doing it through the medium of an international integration policy index. So first, I think before I go into the Indian context, let's look at what integration really means. And this is a very important sub area of the migration studies discipline worldwide, but it's also an area that does not see a great deal of academic consensus. So there are multiple definitions of what integration means. It's a big topic, especially in Europe, for instance. So I've put together the definition that the IOM uses, the International Organization for Migration. But broadly, integration is the process of acculturation or assimilation that a migrant community has, a way of ensuring their access and the facilitation of their access to everyday services and everything that makes their life better in the destination areas and allows them to live at par with locals. So that is broadly where the idea of integration comes from. And one important thing to really remember here is that this is not purely for semi-permanent migrants or permanent migrants. These are also for short-term populations, and inclusive integration policy should be taking into account these different kinds of populations. So the Migrant Integration Policy Index is a policy index put together by the Migration Policy Group in Brussels, Belgium. And this is an index that assesses countries on the basis of their immigrant integration policy. It assesses about 52 countries worldwide, and this is a longitudinal analysis. So every 6 years, every country is reassessed, and you can see in real time how countries improve across the different policy areas. So I'll be talking a little bit more in depth about the different policy areas in MIPEX and how India scores on them. But before that, I'd like to give a brief picture of what immigration into India looks like. I'll spend very little time on the slide because I think both my other co-speakers have really talked at length about what cross-border mobility looks like in India. So these are just some quick numbers from UN DESA. Of course, comparatively speaking, India's immigrant population is not very large, but in absolute numbers, it is still a 5 million plus population. As the first speaker today has emphasized, a lot of this is from neighboring countries. In fact, according to UN DESA, 95% of India's immigrants actually come from the same SDG region, particularly countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Bhutan. And of course, historically, a lot of what we now call cross-border mobility was at one point of time just the intra-state movement of linguistically and culturally similar populations, which now, of course, has national borders attached to them. So now, before I go into the topic of integration policy in India, it's very important to underscore that India does not have a national immigrant integration policy. Rather, we have laws that govern entry into the country, the Passport Act and the passport laws, and we also have acts related to citizenship. But by way of immigrant integration policy, there really isn't anything. So a big question that our team was grappling with when we did the MIPEX analysis was, how do we measure immigrant integration policy when there is no immigrant integration policy at the national level? So we dealt with this in two ways, really. The first was we looked at national level policies which don't explicitly target immigrants, but which implicitly give them access to certain basic things. And the second thing we did was we looked at the regional level policy. We looked at whether particular state governments have policies in place for immigrant communities. And here, interestingly, we did find one example, which I'll go on to talk about. So this is what the MIPEX scores for India looks like. MIPEX has 8 policy areas, which are there in the table right in front of you. And within these 8 policy areas are 58 policy indicators, which measure everything from whether or not there are schemes in place for immigrants, to whether general schemes include them, to whether there is facilitation to ensure that immigrant communities are able to access these schemes. It's fairly exhaustive. So what we find, India actually scores fairly low. 2020 was one of the first years that MIPEX has included developing countries. This was originally started in 2004, and it's only in the last few years that we see more developing countries included in this index, which is why these scores are very important to analyze. And what we find is that India scores very low. In fact, I'll come to the comparative analysis, but India scores a 24 out of 100. And this is largely because of sub-20 scores in 4 key areas, which determine everyday quality of life for immigrant communities. And these are education, labor market mobility, anti-discrimination, and health. And here, I won't go into the exact details, but I will give a couple of examples for each of these policy areas and what we find. So education and health function very similarly in India, in that there is no national level policy, but there are national level general schemes, catch-all schemes, which immigrants are able to take advantage of. So in education, the biggest example, of course, is right to education, the RTE Act in India, which is also a fundamental right, and which provides all children between the ages of 6 and 14 with an education. And the interesting thing about RTE is that although you do have to submit a proof of age to enroll your child in RTE, the RTE also very clearly states that no child can be denied admission due to lack of proof of age. And we do find from the literature and from ground level studies that this is utilized by immigrant communities and refugee communities across the country. We also see a similar situation in health, where national level primary healthcare centers are free, including certain regional schemes like the mobile health scheme that the Delhi government has, which is designed to serve all residents in an area rather than all nationals in an area. So in this way, we do find that there is implicit access granted to immigrant and refugee communities in these areas. In fact, the UNHCR in India actually recommends that asylum-seeking populations make use of these schemes, which don't have national level barriers attached to them. Coming to, however, something like labor market mobility, here we find that there is nothing beyond the very basic. So while India doesn't have a lot of restrictions in place, which means that self-employment visas have no restrictions, ordinary employment visas have very basic restrictions related to economic resources, and there are also procedures in place to recognize foreign qualifications. There's also no further integration measure to help these immigrant communities integrate better into the labor market, promote themselves better in the labor market, and adjust essentially. And as a result, we see a relatively low score there of 17. Anti-discrimination was a very interesting area for us to analyze, because at the national level, beyond the constitutional clauses and a couple of acts like the Prevention of Atrocities SCST Act, we don't really see much even at the national level. In fact, it's even been argued that India needs some kind of an anti-discrimination law, even internally. But for immigrants, it's even less so. In fact, the only reason why we see any score at all for anti-discrimination is because of certain sub-clauses within RTE. And India, of course, has nothing overall. Unfortunately, this is an area that India needs to work on, because on the ground, we do know that many refugee communities, many immigrant communities, very notably African student communities, do face discrimination in India's metro cities. Coming to political participation, here, of course, it's a clear zero. In India, political participation is completely linked to citizenship. In fact, we found that even membership in national political parties, in many cases, has residence and citizenship qualifications attached to them. And coming finally to the trifecta of family reunion, PR, and access to nationality, which are really important areas for semi-permanent migrants coming from various parts of the world. And here we actually see India with its highest scores in family reunion and permanent residence. Family reunion functioning very similarly to labor market, in that there are no additional restrictions, but there is also no additional integration measures. Permanent residence, of course, functions a little differently in India compared to other countries of the world. And here is where we faced the most issues in adapting essentially a very Eurocentric index to the developing country context. India, in fact, doesn't have the concept of PR. India has the concept of a long-term visa, which doesn't come with a lot of restrictions, but it is of limited validity, and it doesn't allow for periods of absence. So hence a score of 46 there. And of course, citizenship is extremely difficult to get in India. It requires a 10+ year residence period and several other requirements as well. And there is no dual citizenship on offer. We also found that despite much controversial laws like the Citizenship Amendment Act, the number of people that the CAA is slated to even benefit is too small for it to even influence the score in this regard. It's according to government numbers, it's only 30,000 out of a 5 million+ immigrant population. So now, none of these numbers, of course, can exist in vacuum. They have to be compared across other countries. And here, across the other 52 MIPEX countries, we find that India has the lowest score. The score is 24 out of 100 compared to the MIPEX average of 50. But it has also been argued, and very persuasively, that India really cannot be compared to countries like the US or the UK or Australia or the countries of Europe, which are historically labor-receiving countries and who have a very different perspective on immigration. So a more relevant comparison here is a comparison to other developing countries, most notably Brazil, Turkey, China, and Indonesia, all of which have been in this index in the last 6 years, like India. And here we find that India is marginally behind countries like China and Indonesia, but significantly behind countries like Brazil and Turkey. And the reason for this primarily is that many of these countries have significantly improved their scores in the last 6 years, which India has not. Brazil has always been a very pro-refugee, pro-immigration country. Its involvement with the Cartagena Declaration, the UNHCR Refugee Convention, its role as a host country for third-party resettlements from the UNHCR, and a host of other policies that they have in various policy areas have brought it essentially to the top 10 of MIPEX. It sits there with other countries like Norway and Germany. China and Indonesia, on the other hand, have improved in particular small areas, which have brought their scores up in the last few years. Turkey is the most interesting case because Turkey was actually languishing at the bottom of this index just about a decade ago. But the historical kind of refugee influx that Turkey has faced in the last 6-7 years has forced the country to really think about immigrant integration policy. And they've made big strides in nearly all the important policy areas. And hence, they've improved 17 plus points across the last 6 years. So now, going really beyond these scores, and this is where I'll kind of wrap up my presentation a little, there is a limitation to these kinds of quantitative indices. And that's something that we as an organization based out of India, working with a Eurocentric index like this, really had to think about. That going beyond these scores, what about the lived realities of immigration? What about the populations who actually live in this country and what do they need? And here a question that we were confronted with on multiple occasions was, why should India care? Why should India care about immigrant communities? And I think the answer to this question is, it's a numerical one, frankly. We have a 5 million plus immigrant population, but more importantly, we have an 18 million plus immigrant population. And these are people who go to various countries around the world and benefit from integration policy. And here, if not anywhere else, India has a lot of opportunity and even the responsibility to lead from the front. Whereas what we really see is that as a result of these ad hoc segmented policies, India has very different relationship with different immigrant communities. So we have the Indo-Nepal Friendship Treaty and the Bhutan Friendship Treaty, as Chitra has elaborated on. We also have a Tibetan rehabilitation policy. In fact, the Tibetan community has been present in India for the last 50 plus years and even runs a government in exile. We also have rehabilitation schemes for Sri Lankan Tamil refugees, very notably by the Tamilian government. And here the regional approach is very important. But on the other hand, we have a very large immigrant and refugee population, a very diverse one from countries like Myanmar and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Syria and various African countries who don't fall under this formal, semi-formal net. Rather, there are ad hoc supporting initiatives from civil society, from international aid organizations, from the UNHCR that really keep them safe. And I think we saw a lot, I'm sure my other speakers, the other speakers today will elaborate on this as well, that we saw the degree of vulnerability that many of these communities faced, particularly during the COVID crisis, and will continue to face as the situation resumes to normalcy and the question of vaccination comes up. So really, we don't expect MIPEX to be an answer to these questions. Rather, we hope that these kinds of quantitative indices, scores on these kinds of quantitative indices, can be the starting point for these questions and allow us to ask what we need of immigrant integration policy. What should this policy look like at the national level? Do we even need a national level integration policy? Do we rather need a regional approach? And how can we best serve, how can integration policy best serve the populations that they are meant for? And I think with that, I would like to end. I do have a key takeaway slide, but yeah, I think I'd like to end there.
Thank you, Rohini ji. That was really thought-provoking in the sense that, you know, many of the countries like India, Nepal, they made some progress in terms of, you know, coming up with the policy framework, but there are limitations and still a long way to go in terms of both framing a uniform set of policies policies, but at the same time making progress in terms of working for the rights of these people in the region and outside of the country. I think we can come back to the discussions later on, but for now, I would like to welcome our next speaker. Our next speaker on the line is Gitanjali. She is the assistant professor at ICFAI University, India, and she will be discussing on the borderland issues of Tripura. So, Gitanjali, welcome.
Thank you. Is my presentation visible?
Yes, it is.
And am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go
Okay,
ahead.
thank you. Thank you. Okay, I shall be speaking on the borderland issues of Tripura. So to begin with, what is the notion of border? It is not a very simplistic concept, as we see that border is often stated to be a line that divides two countries, to speak in a very simplified manner. Rather, border is a physical line which is used for political demarcation, but to note it down, it is a the physical border which is demarcated with the barbed wires actually is a division of emotional bond between the people of two countries, which divides the people of two countries beyond the barbed wires. And my focus is on the psychological impact, the physical impact, which is beyond the political impact. Now, the pre-partition India, which we know as Hindustan, somewhat the map looked like this, where East Pakistan and West Pakistan, that is Pakistan and present Bangladesh, were part of India during the pre-partition era. Now, the area which I am focusing upon is Tripura, the state to which I belong to, which in the pre-partition Tripura was known as Chakla Roshanabad. This area has lost a major tract of its land after the partition has occurred in India. And currently, the districts of Kumilla, major portions of Noakhali, Chittagong, and parts of Sylhet, which belongs to Bangladesh right now, were part of Tripura. So it is not only the tract of land which is lost, even the people also were lost to that part of the land. And this is where the emotional bond has been disconnected. Now, as we can see in the map, the portions marked in red, these are the areas which Tripura has lost. And not only that, as you can see in the present diagram, the hilly Tripura somewhere had a huge portion which somewhere was connected with Bangladesh and India too. Now, the pre-partition India did not have issues with sharing of borders with Assam, Mizoram, which is currently seen. And right now, in Tripura is connected only with Assam and Mizoram. But even there are interstates problem going on in Tripura currently standing in 2020. So the issues are not only country issues, but there are also problems with there are also interstate issues. Now, very interestingly, it has been observed that Rajmala, which is the 15th century chronicle of the kings of Tripura, of the Manikya dynasty, over there, the Bengalis were very much part of Chakla Roshanabad. And currently, when the Bengalis are stated to have been the migrants, it has been seen that even in the 15th century, Bengalis were very much part of this state, that is Tripura. Rather, in Rajmala, it has been documented how the kings have encouraged Bengalis to settle down in Tripura. Now, one of the major reasons why the Bengalis were invited to settle down in Tripura was that educated and trained Bengalis were invited to modernize the royal administration. This was one of the important reasons. Another reason was that the tribal people were mostly into jhuming cultivation. Now, what exactly is jhuming or shifting cultivation? A tract of land is burned and it is used for agricultural purposes. Now, later on, it is seen that when the land is burned at that, now because as huge tract of land was using it for its fertility, the king somewhere realized that the Bengalis were mostly into wet cultivation. So they should be settled down over here so that the tribal people can acculture the modern. So it is in the 15th century only when the Bengalis were settled down in.
Gitanjali ji, it seems like there is some issue with your microphone. Can we first fix it and then move ahead?
Am I not audible?
Can you take it closer? There is some disturbances, interruptions.
Hello?
Yes, it's much better now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So these were the issues which were addressed by the king, and he has wholeheartedly welcomed and he has initiated the settlement of the Bengalis in Tripura. Now, like what happens is, it is often said that the Bengalis are migrants in Tripura, but very interestingly, Bengalis were very much part of Tripura in 15th century itself, whereas in 17th century, the Monks have migrated from Chittagong and have settled down in Tripura. In 18th century, the Manipuri migrants, after the Burmese invasion, came to the king for help. Then not only that, in fact, migration of groups such as the Ryangs, Kukis, Lushais, Monks, Chakwas and Tripuris continued even after the 17th and 15th century. My question is that why the Bengalis then are blamed to be migrants? If they were moving from one district to another, then isn't it that the Bengalis were also part of Tripura? Yes, they were very much part of Tripura, but the political inclusion and exclusion games have somewhere marginalized the concepts. And I want to focus on the fact that the history should be re-looked upon, the political issues should be re-looked upon. Now, the 1966 poem Partition, written by WH Auden, focuses on how Radcliffe, that is Cyril Radcliffe, have drawn the map of India very abruptly. I just want to focus on the lines marked in red. The maps at his disposal were out of date. Over here, his is Cyril Radcliffe, who is one of the major proponents who has drawn the map of India and Pakistan, that is East Pakistan and West Pakistan. So the maps he has drawn, the maps which were given to him were outdated, and the census returns almost certainly incorrect. But there was no time to check them, no time to inspect contested areas. The weather was frightfully hot, and a bout of dysentery kept him constantly on the trot. But in 7 weeks it was done. The frontiers divided, a continent for better or worse. was divided. So very abruptly and without even proper documentation, he has drawn the lines. And the commission was constituted in June 30, 1947. And before August 15, 1947, he was forced to submit his report. While submitting his report, he has shown his dissatisfaction, and he has said that he had doubts over the Chittagong Hill tract, which had only 3% of the Muslim population. One of the reasons of the division was the Hindu-Muslim almost the divide and rule policy which was played, that the Muslims and Hindus, this was one of the reasons why the state was divided, right? So he has pointed out that in Chittagong Hill tract, only 3% of Muslims were residing, and the non-Muslims did not wanted to be a part of East Bengal. They wanted to be part of India, but how? Because of its geographical location, it belonged to that part of the land. So these were the issues which were later on tried to, after 1947, in 1958, and even beyond that, the prime ministers of the two nations tried to resolve. But one issue, that is the dispute of Feni River of Tripura, which is a border dispute, is even now not settled in 2020. And this border agreement continues from 1974 itself. So the border dispute issues are continuing even now, which haven't been addressed even now. Now, border management is a very big issue in Tripura, where the topography is very challenging for the BSF Jawans, where the topography is not only flat, riverine areas or hilly jungles, which makes the patrolling difficult. Of course, as it has been seen in all the parts of the world, illegal trading is going on because of porous nature of the border. But one major problem with India and Tripura border is that the overpopulation of the Bangladesh, and it has been reported in many cases that because of this issue, the Bangladesh people keeps on moving from Bangladesh to India because of the porous nature of the border. Now, not only these issues, but there are several other issues also which we need to focus upon. According to a reporter of Z News, pillar number 23 is situated in the courtyard of a family, and half of their land belongs to Bangladesh and the other half belongs to India, with no fencing in between. When the Redcliffe line was established, two brothers of the house belonged to India and the other two brothers of the same family belonged to Bangladesh. Now, these issues haven't yet been resolved, and these families even now stays together. It has been seen that the kids of India moving to Bangladesh and studying in the Bangladesh schools. It has also been seen how the ration, the PDS keeps on the distribution of public essentials, how it keeps on going for illegal trading. So these are the issues which are happening each and every day and are not addressed even now. So even because of the lack of border guidelines, because of lack of judicial and law enforcement, these issues haven't been addressed yet. So these are some of the reasons why the border mismanagement is happening over here. I want to focus on the Muhuri River tract. Even nature played very wickedly over here, where we see that the Muhuri sector in Bilonia has a huge tract of land of approximately 46 acres, where the river Muhuri all of a sudden changed its course, and this has resulted in the formation of a char. So now what happened is that the people of Bilonia use this char as a cremation ground known as the Shoshanet char. Now, this land, as it is a riverine area which cannot be demarcated with physical border or with barbed wires, has become a major issue for the BSF Jawans to guard that area, because as it has changed its course of direction. So now the problem has to be resettled, and it has to be addressed, as it is high time the BSF Jawans are facing huge difficulties in guarding those areas. To address these issues, of course, few measures have been taken. One of the measure is integrated checkposts, which have been established, and three main functions are customs, immigration, and border securities. Of course, import and export business is going on in the in between the two nations, but again, it has been seen due to lack of facilities, the BSF Jawans and the Indian security officers cannot maintain the true, or they cannot fulfill because they are not given proper equipments, they don't have proper facilities, they lack infrastructure. Because of those issues, many loopholes are yet prevalent. Another significant the thing which has been done by the two nations are establishment of the border huts. It has been seen that in many parts of Tripura, presently in Shimonto Hut and in Bilonia, border huts have been established where, of course, due to COVID's crisis, these huts are right now not working. It has been currently stopped because of the COVID crisis. But previously, where both the people, especially those business, small businessmen, those vegetable vendors and all those people, were were given a space to get settled in the border huts, and how they have helped in building the relationship between the two nations. So these are the small steps which has been taken by the government to settle on the border issues. Thanking you, awaiting for questions, if any doubt.
Thank you, Gitanjali ji, for that very interesting presentation. Without further ado, I would like to invite another speaker, Professor Parvati Nair. Professor Parvati Nair is a professor of Hispanic Cultural and Migration Studies, Queen Mary University of London, UK. So welcome to the panel, and Professor Nair will be speaking on understanding international migration in the context of global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. As I have said in the very outset, I think this is a timely panel because there is going to be a regional review of GCM next month, and in 2022 we'll have global review. So I think this is also timely in that sense that it will inform us about the development that are happening on the migration and how they are related in terms of the commitments that many of the countries that we covered today have been measured up to in terms of making progress on GCA. Professor Nair, please, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for this kind invitation to this very interesting conference organized by NICE. And my thanks to the organizers and also to the panelists whose papers I've been listening to just now. And really, I found it absolutely fascinating to have this deep insight into the region and the dynamics of migration in the region. I'm hoping that what I say will have some synergy with what has gone before. I'm based in London, so just to say that there were sort of time issues as well. So in terms of my possibility to, it's a snowy morning here in London. So thank you for having me here. Just to say that my focus is really going to be around international migration and the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. My own background, as you've heard, is really as somebody who's been working on sociocultural aspects of migration, both perceptions and lived experiences of migration, in mostly around the Mediterranean region. And recently I've extended my interest a little bit to include the subcontinent. But mostly I come with a comparative approach, and also the experience of having spent 7 years at the United Nations University, which was then chairing the early negotiations towards the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And I was the working level chair of that effort, and so saw the process as it came into being. And I wanted to share some reflections with you, some thoughts on some of the issues and challenges that face both, I think, well, obviously migrants and host societies on the ground, but also in terms of academics working on migration and our dialogue with policymakers, because ultimately what happens on the ground is so shaped by policy. And in that sense, I feel that in a career, or in the course of my work in this area, I have often seen a situation where we as migration scholars or people working on migration, we use different methodologies, but we deeply understand what the issues are, what the dynamics are, and we understand what needs to be set right. But there appears to be a complete sort of gap or lack of connection very often between what we advocate and what happens in terms of policy making. And I think some of the papers that went before this talk of mine, some of the papers that preceded me, the colleagues on this panel, touched on some of those key issues to do with borders, with maps, with historical political contexts, and with local as well as international dynamics. So, and likewise, I feel also that think tanks such as NICE, for example, play a very, very fundamental role to bridge what is sort of academic approach of migration with the world of policymakers, particularly through their convening powers and their ability to transmit and translate academic findings into language that is meaningful for policymakers. So in terms of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, it is, of course, a compact that sits alongside the Global Compact for Refugees. And indeed, the two were processes that were parallel processes, both shepherded by the UN system and adopted not by all, but by the majority of nation states. And they fall completely in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that have been set in place for 2030. If there is something that is troubling for me in terms of my own experience of fieldwork, it is this continuing separation, and there are very good legal reasons for this, separation between refugees and migrants. And what I would like to really emphasize is that the logic behind this separation, and indeed we should remember that the United Nations itself was founded upon the whole crisis of refugees that occurred in the wake of the Second World War. And there was very early on a commitment by states to offer asylum where there were worthy cases. So if we look at the history of refugee law and of refugee situations, we see that it is a process which may be chaotic, which may be crisis provoked and critical in its own unfolding, but nevertheless sits squarely in alignment with the fundamental idea that still governs international relations and that still governs all dialogue at the United Nations, which is the notion of sovereignty and the notion that states are decision makers and are defined by their borders, and that they have the right, therefore, to determine, through whatever means, democratic means and other means, to determine what happens within their boundaries. This is a view that comes into conflict with many of the systems and processes that govern our world. We live in an eminently globalized world. Wherever our countries or our situations are in the spectrum of development, we're still financially and in other ways living in an interconnected world. And I will stress the other ways, because I think the pandemic above all has shown the fundamentally interconnected and mobile nature of the way in which humans live in the world. So we have this attempt, if you like, to create organization and structure through nation states. And within that, there is the legal framework of refugee law, which then allows for certain people who are deemed by the receiving nation state to be worthy of being given shelter to receive that shelter. And then there are 258 million people today in the world who are international migrants. And these are the numbers that we know. Because of course we can only talk in terms of data about the data that is known. And when you enter the world of migration and you look at mass migrant movements, which are occurring as we speak, some of them were mentioned earlier today in Asia, so Afghanistan westward, for example, from Afghanistan to Iran, countries which are countries of receiving migration, of transit migration, and of emigration. There are a whole host, there are chains of countries like that. If we look at the movements that are occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, northward, with a vast number of people getting stuck in Libya under horrendous conditions, blocked by European border security. If we look at the movements in Latin America, where people are walking in masses, finding jobs along the way, some going to Brazil, others going to Mexico in an effort to go to the US, we see this mass movement of people. Of the 258 million people that we know about, many of them will not be these people who are in precarious situations, because many of them, as some of the papers already pointed out in the India, in the subcontinental context, are people without papers, without documentation. They're undocumented. So we can talk about the documented, and we can talk about what we know of the undocumented through field work or through studies on trafficking, on smuggling, etc. The whole underground business of human mobility. It's a very profitable business and a very dangerous one for the people concerned. So of these 258 million, the vast majority are people who are traveling with papers and with a certain degree of comfort, with a personal strategy or a social strategy that is accepted. And there are legal channels for such movements. They may be tourists, they may be international students, they may be workers going with contracts, they may be executives, they may be doctors, they may be nurses being hired for short-term, long-term contracts. There are a large number of people migrating in ways that are safe. But there is a significant minority that is not. And that minority are those who don't readily appear in statistics and in the data, because it is so difficult to document those who are not documented. And yet it is extremely important to bear in mind why they do this. Why does someone move from one place to another? And the triggers are multiple. In today's world, when we look at the world, we see that one of the most important fundamental frames for displacing people is our environmental causes and environmental crisis. That combines in many places, quite naturally, in fact, because of the ways in which one crisis provokes other crises. It combines with histories of poverty and situations of poverty in a world that is interconnected by mass media, and there is great awareness amongst youth populations of opportunities elsewhere. We see also that there is conflict. There are tremendous conflicts around the world that are occurring, which are displacing people. And we see also that there are strategies, empowerment strategies, that families and communities resort to, whereby remittances play a very, very key part. So if you take a country like Philippines, for example, or Bangladesh, here in London, we have the biggest community of Bangladeshis outside of Bangladesh. They play a key role in providing remittances to one, maybe two generations of family back in their countries. So we see these multiple triggers for human mobility. And yet, these people who are often having to blocked, unable to obtain visas in the legal way, because if they went to a consulate, they simply wouldn't get it, even for a holiday, because they cannot provide the documentation that is required in order to obtain those visas. They go through underhand or, they go through illegal means in order to make their journeys. And in so doing, they enter truly disturbing and troubling situations. Situations such as the ones that are occurring right now as I speak on the border of Bosnia and Croatia and many other borders. And if we go to those places, we will find a vast number of young people from the subcontinent, from South Asia. And there are large, IOM, for example, has set up certain safe houses, but the conditions are extremely challenging, particularly at this time of year when the temperatures are very low in Europe. So my question then is, when we've had these two global compacts and we have these, how do we determine who is a refugee and who is a migrant? Because when you look on the ground, what you will see is that there are many human situations. And I'm slightly reluctant to use the word humanitarianism, because humanitarianism is almost like charity. It's something you sort of do to others, when actually the situation that affects these people is a situation that has a remit far beyond the people concerned. Of course, the people concerned are the ones living through it. But this is a reflection on democracy. It is a reflection on human rights. And it's a reflection, if you like, on the basic ethics of sovereignty. And it raises various questions. The question of responsibility. Who is responsible, and how can one be responsible for people who fall between the cracks between legal migrants and people accepted as refugees? I'm not sure I have an answer, but I think it was my aim is really more to ask these questions, for us to discuss them, because I think that in the context of the many issues that we've looked at in this morning, there are contexts of social stratification, local, regional, and national politics. We have questions of economic arrangements. We have systems of power that are being shaped and challenged and contested as we speak through the movements of people. We have history, we have politics, we have economics, all coming together in the field of migration, and in order to understand what it is that, what it is that puts people down a path of non-documentation. Why would a citizen of one country choose to be a non-citizen and to be invisible? I think it's absolutely important to understand where responsibility lies, and how can we, with these two global compacts and with the sustainable development goals, which proclaim that no one will be left behind, how can there be a more inclusive policy towards migration that allows for flexibility and allows for a dialogue across countries that adopts an approach of multilateralism and shared responsibilities. So I'm going to more or less leave it there, but just to say that the pandemic, of course, both complicates and also clarifies in some ways the absolutely vital need for taking that responsibility. The question of vaccination came into into mention earlier this morning. I think that's a very, very important point, because actually unvaccinated people can, will continue to carry the virus and will continue to transmit. So, and will then become the breeding ground for variants of the pandemic, of the virus, thereby creating, if you like, a continuation of the situation. So just to say also that there was a mention of a comparative focus of the region with other parts of the world. I'm currently just working with colleagues in India, the GRFDT, and also with colleagues in Brazil for a comparative study looking at migration, pandemic, and responses from the third sector. We haven't mentioned the third sector this morning, but I think it might be important to look at the role of civil society, migrant-led organizations, and also faith-based organizations in supporting people, particularly people who are in precarious situations, vulnerable situations, and also in filling the gaps that have arisen because of insufficient response and responsibility towards the absolute reality of human mobility in all its entirety. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Nair. That is very comprehensive presentations, and then I think you raised very pertinent issues that maybe that we can discuss today. Pramodji, do we have Arpitaji for the presentation? No?
No, sir. He has some. She has some internet issues, so she will not be joining today.
Okay, so maybe we can start collecting questions now. So with this, I would like to invite our participants to start inboxing their questions and concerns so that we can share it with our panelists. So I do have 2-3 questions. I think any one of the panelists, or if you like, some of you could respond to those questions. The first is, as Professor Nair was referring to earlier, the COVID situation has really taught lessons to us in terms of how we protect the rights of migrant workers of the region. And this also shows that our respective governments and other stakeholders working in this area were not prepared enough. We do have global compact on migration, but basically that focuses on the international migration. And we have another instrument called SARC declarations, which basically focuses on protecting the right of migrant workers from the South Asia region to the other Gulf region and Malaysia. But I was wondering whether or what can we do in terms of being prepared in these kind of situations in the future. We saw masses of people, caravans of people crossing borders during the pandemic situation, and it was very difficult to provide services to protect them in this kind of situation. And the next questions, I think the presentations by Chitra and Rohini, you are referring to the problems and challenges facing migrant workers in accessing services in India. I was a little bit, in a way, interested to understand further. It seems like in the recent years, if a migrant or immigrants do not have, let's say migrants do not have Aadhaar card, they seem to be deprived of many of these services, because while I was in Delhi for one of the studies, I was basically focusing in my study on the issue of Nepali migrant workers, and they shared their experience that previously they didn't have this kind of experience, but in the recent years with these laws coming out, they had to go through a lot of challenges because now they don't have, they did have ration card, but they have to have the Aadhaar card in order to access these basic services. So can maybe, you did present about the implications of various policies, development of various policies, and the implicit and explicit provisions of these policies in terms of providing services to immigrants and migrants. It would be really interesting to have this kind of qualitative studies about migrants and their experience. So if you have any insights into that, that would be really interesting. There was also reference in regards to the implications of the geopolitical and economic interest overriding the issue of migrants and immigrants in our region, be it in Nepal or in India or in other countries of the region. We have a similar experience here in Nepal. We have migrant workers from India, Bangladesh, and other countries, and they are not really protected by our policies and the laws, and vice versa. So, what kind of and Parvati was already, mentioning earlier, what kind of mechanisms of arrangement that we can come up with so that these people working in the vulnerable and precarious situation can be better protected.
They have the there is some state which is there is no war. So
there is a noise coming out. Can you please mute your mic? Okay, good. And I think the questions to Professor Nair, I have been speaking various platforms about the usefulness of this GCM. If this kind of framework, although it is a non-binding one, we have a framework like this, Global Compact on for Migration. We have SDG, we have Colombo Process, ADG, and things like that. But for me, it's not really working for the benefit of the migrant workers who are already working in the precarious conditions. And I was thinking when we are focusing on making the states, including ours, responsible in order to protect these migrant workers and their rights, what kind of strategies do you think that would be relevant in terms of making the countries of destination, countries of origin, as well as we have employers, intermediaries, and international communities and UN agencies responsible, particularly in light of the experience that we've had in time of COVID, because I think that it's not working. Nobody, as you said earlier, nobody is responsible in terms of protecting these people, and there is a risk that while people start migrating to these countries, even while their rights have been violated, their rights have been depleted, what kind of precedent that it will have for the countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, and India, and from where millions of migrant workers migrate for employment. With this, I think anyone can respond to. I will pick up the questions and respond, but I will start collecting some of the questions that we may have in the chat box until then. So you can raise your hand.
Sorry, but I'm not getting a hand to raise. I don't know where.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, then I'll just try and answer your last question. I think one of the, I agree with you that I think these non-binding agreements and compacts are, maybe they make marginal difference, not huge ones. And the dynamics, and we can see that very clearly in the Africa situation, whereby, the question of reintegration of migrants is being attended to, which is, of course, something that supports deportation of migrants from countries where they are not wanted. And then the question of, what exactly what exactly is happening in that under the aegis of reintegration. It's often a process that lasts a few weeks or a maximum a couple of months, and then people are usually returned to the road once again on the illegal track, trying undocumented route, trying to get back. So it's more of the same, and we don't really see much improvement. But I think that in this country, and I'm sitting here in London in Brexit, in the wake of Brexit, where, as you probably know, we have a national health system that is extremely stressed now because of the pandemic. There are no beds in London, in the hospitals, as a critical situation in the country, and we're all very much restricted to being at home, with minimal going out. This means that there is a massive crisis because the health sector in this country, in the UK, and I'm giving you a UK example because I'm more familiar with it than with the subcontinent. But here in the UK, we had a very large number of health workers who came from Europe and who are Europeans and had the right to live and work here. But of course, the Brexit vote and the exit from Europe that happened at the end of last year has meant that these people have decided, most of them have gone back to Europe because they feel that they are more welcome there than they are here. And so therefore, I think one of the things that we need to think about in terms of changing the perception of migrants, because migrants make valuable contributions. As we've seen in the talks that went before, they're seasonal workers, they're agricultural workers, they're filling in the gaps, doing the jobs that need to be done. These are not recognized very often. And so the perception of migrants and also the media's role in educating the public, informing the public around migration is a vital one. And I think we need to, in discussing policy and how we can shift policy and actually create practices, we need to start with thinking about how voters and citizens can be better informed on migration. And I think that engaging with the media and having the media not cover the crisis story, because they're very good at that. They're very good at, the crisis story, the emergency. It's the long story. It's the long story that we need more knowledge about. Why people migrate, why most of us have migration in our backgrounds from one place or another. We all, if we are not migrants, then somebody in our background or in our family, was many internal migrants. The situation in India very clearly shows that the human needs of people, whether they're international or internal migrants, are often the same. And the pandemic showed that very clearly, where you have three kinds of crisis, where you have, internal migrants who were given, in a lockdown that was decided with 4 hours notice. You had internal migrants, you have return migrants coming back from the Gulf, and you have the situation of people in the northeast of the country coming from neighboring countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, etc., who were stranded. And again, it was the third sector that stepped in to help them and to try and get them onto buses, to get them fed, etc. So I think you're right. There's a lot of work to be done there.
Thank you, Professor Nair. Now, maybe Chitra and Rohini, you have questions in the inbox as well, so you'd like to maybe pick up those questions as well.
Yeah, sure. I would also continue from Dr. Jeevan, what you had said about Aadhaar and how important of a document it has become. I think, especially when we are looking at during the pandemic, and now that the borders have opened up and there is certain mobility, Aadhaar also becomes an important document to be able to access healthcare in India. And talking about qualitative, there has also been recently, very recently in 2020, a qualitative study on the experience of Nepalese migrants in India, especially when it comes to healthcare. And the experience has not been very favorable because there are discrimination that are practiced against Nepalese migrants, and also the same time that there is a problem of documentation. Yeah, I would talk that. So talking about Indian migrants in Nepal, I will say that I'm not very thorough with it, right? However, there is obviously a kind of imbalance in the relationship where, I mean, when you compare, say, the Nepalese migrants in India and the Indian migrants in Nepal. So, I mean, I have what I understand of it, but I'll still refrain from giving an opinion on it.
Thank you very much, Chitra ji. I think Anju ji, you have a questions. You have a questions about what is India's positions in terms of responding to Rohingya issue, if you like. Since Anju ji is not with us now.
Dr. If I could respond to that.
Yes, please.
Right. That actually, this is an area of research for us at India Migration now. So I felt I should say something here. So as I mentioned in my presentation, India does have very differential relationships with different refugee communities. And we do see that in the cases of groups like the Rohingya, where there is no formal policy, rather there's just the UNHCR and its ecosystem, there things are very much dictated by the relationship that the Indian government has with the host government in question. And the Rohingya situation is very unique in that sense because they're a stateless community. So they don't really have a country to go back to. Their host government will not, in many cases, accept them. We do see, interestingly, India's relationship with the community has developed in particular ways. So there was an influx that happened in the earlier part of the last decade, so in 2011-12. And at that time, India was offering long-term visas to this community, which have a 5-year validity. But what we see now from our own fieldwork is that many of these LTVs have now expired. And even though these community members are certified refugees by the UNHCR, their legality in the eyes of the state has lapsed, so to speak, because their LTVs have lapsed. But at the same time, the Indian government also has a relationship with the government of Myanmar. And this has been developing for a while. In fact, in 2016, our then Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj actually visited both Bangladesh and Myanmar, and the Honorable S. Jaishankar, who is now our External Minister and who was then the Foreign Secretary, actually visited Rakhine State. And at the time, the Indian government actually sent aid to the Bangladesh government in 2017 during the massive influx of July to September, and subsequently also gave money to the state of Rakhine for development aid. But at the same time, we also see that the community within India is largely ignored. So there is definitely a discrepancy, or rather, I won't really say ignored, but in many cases, the government does not really have anything to say. They're not ignored in the civil society context. There are many civil society organizations working for them. So there is a bit of a disbalance there, but we do see that the Indian government has particular relationships with these host countries, which may or may not be influencing the way that the government perceives the refugee communities in the country.
Thank you very much, Rohini ji. I think we've already spent about I think more than 100 minutes, which is the time allotted for our panel. Dr. Parvati, do we like to end?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So with this, I think we've come to the end of our panel. I would like to personally thank all the panelists and the participants and all our viewers from social media. So I would also like to thank Nice, how do you call it? But thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this session. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, sir. Distinguished chair and speakers, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the 8th session. It is my honor to propose vote of thanks on behalf of NICE to all who have graced us with their presence and contributed their part to make this event a resounding success. First of all, we would like to express our profound gratitude and sincere thanks to Dr. Jeevan Baniya for agreeing to chair this session. Our sincere thanks also goes to all our speakers for being part of this event and delivering such a comprehensive and convincing presentation. We are really honored to have you all the speakers with us here today. We'd also like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends, experts, academia, and different organizations. Finally, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who are participating in the webinar and those who are watching us live on YouTube channel. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making the session productive with your questions. We are truly honored to have you with us this evening and hope to stay connected with you in the future as well. It has really been a pleasure. Also do join at our next session. Thank you very much.